I'm really happy to welcome you here to a side event on addressing sexual violence against men and boys to maintain international peace and security. The Secretary General's latest annual report on conflict-related sexual violence underscores that, unfortunately, sexual violence pervades in all conflicts where the UN is present. Now, women and girls remain the group most affected by conflict-related sexual violence in Ukraine and in wars around the world, but there's no hierarchy for trauma survivors. This meeting is intended not only to highlight the increasing evidence of the systematic use of sexual violence by Russia against Ukrainians, particularly against captives, who are mostly men and boys. We also hope to emphasize the need to put in place survivor-centered responses and prevention measures for all people affected by conflict-related sexual violence, bearing in mind the need for gender-specific responses. I also just want to acknowledge the obvious, that there are very few men in this room here, and if you eliminate the folks up here, there's even fewer men as a proportion. That is the case in almost all of the conflict-related sexual violence meetings that I've gone to, and often in all the gender equality meetings that I've gone to, and it's really horrible on that. I do wish, thank you to all the women who have come here. I do wish that the interest in understanding this phenomenon, particularly as it affects men and boys in this context, was more widespread across men here at the UN and writ large. So my own homework is to, next time, try to bring more men to this meeting. We also hope, frankly, that we can take advantage of the combined expertise, not only on the panel and on the screen, but from all of you. So I do hope there's a time for us to also exchange our experiences. We do have a tremendously expert and insightful panel, starting with Pablo de Grief on my far left, the Commissioner of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. Joining us online are Veronica Plotnikova, the head of the Coordination Unit for the Support of Victims and Witnesses of War Crimes and Other International Crimes of the Office of the Prosecutor General in Ukraine. Also joining online is Danielle Bell, head of Mission, United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. And here in the room, Katerina Shunevich, sorry if I mispronounced, head of the Analytical Center at the Ukrainian Women Lawyers Association, or JURFEM, and of course, Charu Lata-Hogg, Executive Director of the All Survivors Project. Let me thank my fellow co-sponsors for this event, the permanent missions of Colombia, of Liechtenstein, and of Ukraine. We have partnered on this issue with All Survivors Project a couple of times now, and we will continue to try to draw attention, I think, to this aspect of this particular phenomenon. It's wonderful to partner with you both again. And on behalf of all of us, let me thank OHCHR and the Independent International Commission of Inquiry for their essential work on verifying and reporting cases of human rights violations in Ukraine, particularly since Russia's full-scale invasion. Their work is just absolutely essential. All Ukrainians have suffered from Russia's aggression, and part of the dividend of their struggle should be a society free from all kinds of gender-based violence. Ukrainian women and women's rights organizations, such as the Ukrainian Women Lawyers Association, represented today by Katerina, are central to that effort, and we're really proud to support you. I also want to thank, as I said earlier, Charu and All Survivors Project for her tireless work to convene this event, to raise awareness of CRSV against men and boys, and to ensure all survivors of conflict-related violence get the support and the care that they need. Before handing over to Pablo, our first panelist, I'd like to share a pre-recorded introductory message from Andrei Kustin, the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, which will be on your screen at the end of the room here.
Dear attendees, I want to thank you for coming together today to discuss this difficult topic of sexual violence related to conflict, and specifically sexual violence that targets men and boys in conflict. These subjects are uncomfortable for many people, and often they are discussed in side rooms and in private meetings, instead of getting the attention they deserve. So let me say clearly, during the 10 years that Russia has been at war against Ukraine, Russian forces have wielded sexual violence and threats of sexual violence as a tool of war and a tool of occupation. It is a tactic of subjugation, of psychological terror, of control, of coercion, and it is integral to the execution of their plans in Ukrainian territories. This violence targets men and women, boys and girls, civilians and prisoners of war, and it is past time for us to speak openly about how Russia uses sexual violence against Ukraine, because it exposes the nature of what they hope to achieve in Ukraine and the nature of the regime's intentions. We strongly believe Russia is guilty of the crime of aggression and the crime of genocide. It must be held to account for these crimes and 126,000 other war crimes they have committed in Ukraine, and this count is only since 2022. Russia's bloody aggression against Ukraine and Ukrainians, which targets civilians at will and at random, and frequently violates the laws of war against our soldiers, enshrines CRSV as a tool of psychological terror and control to erode Ukraine's identity and the Ukrainian nation. It is a part of a broad pattern since 2022. Russians shell Ukrainian ports, critical infrastructure and residential buildings. They steal Ukrainian children, forcibly adopt them off to Russian families, and begin to indoctrinate them to fight their own countrymen someday. They execute the occupation of Ukrainian lands with a Stalinist playbook. Sexual violence is Russia's systematic policy. It must be strongly condemned by the civilized world. Russia must be held to account for these crimes. Last September, I met with the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Dr. Alice Jill Edwards, and reported that Russia has built a sophisticated system of torture and ill-treatment of Ukrainians, used against both prisoners of war and civilians. Even then, I emphasized that the majority of Ukrainian prisoners of war were subjugated to torture, rape, threats of sexual violence, and other forms of ill-treatment. At the time, it was claimed that these were subjective and anecdotal Ukrainian assessments, not yet supported by evidence. Well, last month, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine published a periodic report on the human rights situation in Ukraine for the period from December 1st, 2023 to February 29th, 2024. According to the findings of this report, torture and ill-treatment of Ukrainian prisoners of war in Russian internment facilities is widespread and routine. Prisoners of war are held in conditions that do not meet the requirements of international humanitarian law. A stark fact that stands out in this report is that more than half of Ukrainian male prisoners of war interviewed by the mission for the purposes of the report stated that during their internment they were subjected to sexual violence, including attempted rape, threats of rape and castration, beating or electric shocks to the genitals, and repeated forced exposure, for example during interrogations. These are now irrefutable facts that are confirmed by independent experts from international organizations, though of course the Russian Federation claimed and still claims that these are false accusations. If you turn to the dry statistics of documented cases of CRSV used by Russian forces against Ukraine, you will see an atypical picture for an armed conflict. There is little difference between the number of acts of CRSV committed against women and the number committed against men. In all territories occupied by Russia, sexual violence is applied equally to both women and men. This is an undeniable indicator that CRSV is part of Russia's policy of aggression, under which the gender, age, or status of the victim do not matter. Russians commit these crimes against anyone who considers themselves Ukrainian. Since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, Ukrainian prosecutors have recorded 290 cases of CRSV, men 102, women 188, of which 15 were minors, including 14 girls and 1 boy. These cases include rape, mutilation or violence against genitals, forced exposure, threats of and attempted rape, and being forced to watch the sexual abuse of loved ones and family members. These cases are spread across the regions that Russians have touched, including 85 cases in Kherson, 56 cases in Kyiv, 75 cases in Donetsk, 33 cases in Kharkiv, 18 cases in Zaporizhia, 8 in Chernihiv, 3 in Luhansk, 10 in Mykolaiv, and 2 in Sumy regions. So I will say again, sexual violence is Russia's systematic policy. We all know that CRSV is extremely difficult to document because of reliving the trauma and due to the risk of stigmatization for speaking out about these crimes. This is one of the main challenges for Ukrainian prosecutors, ensuring that we can work with victims of CRSV in such a way as not to cause undue mental suffering and to ensure we conduct investigations as delicately as possible and with minimum disruption to the lifestyle of the victim. For this purpose, in September 2022, a specialized department was established within the Prosecutor General's office, the main task of which is to document cases of CRSV, identify patterns in the commission of these crimes, and organize proper investigations. Additionally, in April 2023, a specialized independent unit, the Victims and Witnesses Coordination Center, was established within the structure of the Prosecutor General's office. Any services to victims and witnesses are provided only with their consent and in compliance with the principle of confidentiality. You will hear more about this work from the member of my team, Veronika, who is on the panel today. Russia's use of CRSV, committed against men and against soldiers, is beginning to be better understood. Articles are published, documentaries are filmed. My team will always do what we can to remind victims and survivors that the shame is never theirs. But the shame of the Russian Federation, the shame of the regime and an army that fights wars of aggressions, as if there were no lessons learned from the last century, no fundamental architecture of international human rights law now integral to the rules of war. Those who have endured, survived, and persevered, those who have come forward so far to declare these crimes and testify and to encourage other survivors to do so, are individuals of incredible will and courage, and a testament to a nation that will survive against steep odds. I thank you all for your efforts to support CRSV victims and survivors. Every public discussion, every bold statement bring us closer to the moment when CRSV will gradually cease to be a stigma for those who suffered it, and instead become a black mark on the reputation of those who organized, committed, and tolerated it.
I thank the Prosecutor General of Ukraine and thank our friends from Ukraine for facilitating his introductory message for us. And I now give the floor to Pablo de Grief, the Commissioner of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Before anything else, I, of course, would like to express my gratitude for the invitation to participate in this event. And I also want to congratulate All Survivors Project for organizing a discussion on a phenomenon that does not receive sufficient attention from the international community. I am, of course, delighted to share the panel with my very expert and knowledgeable co-panelists. The concept note for the event mentions that the organization has evidence of sexual violence against men and boys in 25 different situations of armed conflict in recent decades. As sexual violence against women, and perhaps to a greater degree, it is likely that the prevalence of sexual violence against men and boys is underreported, and if one takes into account that it occurs not only in situations of conflict, but even in ordinary jurisdictions, mostly under detention, precisely the context in which also in conflict it occurs most frequently, given gender disparities in the population of those criminally detained all over the world, we are dealing with a phenomenon affecting large numbers of victims indeed. Since I'm invited here in my capacity as Commissioner of the Independent Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, I will limit myself to the Commission's findings. The Commission has been reporting on torture and on conflict-related sexual violence since its first report to the General Assembly in October 22, that is just 6 months after it was established. Thus, for example, in that early report, the Commission stated in paragraph 82, Russian armed forces carried out long interrogation sessions, sometimes lasting for days, which were combined with threats, intimidation, ill-treatment, sexual violence, and torture. In paragraph 84, we report, quote, after transfer to and detention in the Russian Federation, victims described how they were stripped naked again, were forced to stand naked in front of others for hours, or had hands and feet tied and underwent long beating sessions. In the same report, in paragraph 90, we report a particularly gruesome but not exceptional incident involving sexual violence against an entire family comprising a woman, a man, and their young daughter. And this is a quote. In Kiev province in March 2022, 2 Russian soldiers entered a home, raped a 22-year-old woman several times, committed acts of sexual violence on her husband, and forced the couple to have sexual intercourse in their presence. Then, and this is heartbreaking, one of the soldiers forced their 4-year-old daughter to perform oral sex on him, which is a rape. In the Commission's first report to the Human Rights Council in March 2023, we document incidents of torture and conflict-related sexual violence in 9 provinces in Ukraine and in detention centers in the Russian Federation. In that report, we describe treatment suffered by both civilians and Ukrainian prisoners of war, involving forced nudity, rape, the use of electricity on genitals, traction on the penis using a rope, as well as emasculation. With respect to torture, we argued, based on patterns that emerged from the investigation, that its use was widespread and systematic, and that if it could be established that it responded to a policy, it would constitute not just war crimes and the corresponding human rights violations, but also crimes against humanity. This is an argument that the Commission articulates in details and illustrates amply in its detailed 170-page long conference room paper. That paper documents plenty of cases of sexual violence against men, boys, members of the LGBTQ communities, women and girls, under diverse circumstances in different areas of the country, and at the time that we were writing the CRP, the majority of them civilians. In the Commission's latest report to the Human Rights Council, we pay special attention to the treatment of Ukrainian prisoners of war, which included sexualized forms of torture. Paragraph 67 of that report, for example, reads, former male detainees reported threats of rape, objectionable touching during invasive body searches, and torture on the genitals. One victim of beating and electric shocks to the genitals said that one of the perpetrators told him, I will beat everything out of you so you cannot make children. A similar statement was made to another detainee. A victim recounted perpetrators' attempts to cut his penis in order to, quote, prevent him from having more children. And this is all a quote from the report. The Commission thus has accumulated significant evidence of sexual violence by Russian Federation authorities against women ranging from 4 to 83 years of age, but also against men, both civilians and members of the Ukrainian armed forces. In the course of its investigations, the Commission has made progress in documenting not just the widespread and systematic nature of torture, sometimes involving sexualized elements, but also of its structural dimensions, including the variety of Russian Federation entities that enable it, take part in it, are aware of the torments that victims, male, female, or otherwise, are subjected to. The Commission has called, regarding these violations, as for the others it has investigated, for the implementation of a broad notion of accountability, including criminal justice for those responsible, as well as the satisfaction of the rights to truth, justice, reparations, and guarantees of non-recurrence of the victims. We have, for instance, insisted on the importance of offering victims prompt and effective mental health and psychosocial support. The particular group of victims that occupy us in this discussion today, men and boys, could certainly profit from that support. The international community, in our opinion, can do much more to back these efforts. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner, and also through you, your team, for all the work to document and investigate the horrible cases that you shared with us today. I will now give the floor to Ms. Veronika Plotnikova, the head of the Coordination Unit for the Support of Victims and Witnesses of War Crimes and Other International Crimes in the Office of the Prosecutor General, who will be joining us online.
Yes, I'm online, dear colleagues, and I'm very delighted to be with you today and to participate in such an event. I'm glad to be with you and to tell you more about our efforts on the field of protection and support for victims and witnesses of war crimes, and first of all, for male victims of CRSV. As Mr. Kostin mentioned, now we know that Russians use sexual violence as a tool of war and a tool of occupation. For this reason, victims and witnesses of relevant and lawful acts must be supported, first of all, and their rights must be protected using the best world practices. Therefore, in order to provide an effective mechanism for support and protection for victims, we established our coordination center in the system of prosecutors' offices. We want to enhance the protection of victims from psychological harm, increase the efficiency of their participation in criminal proceedings, and increase their access to justice. And first of all, not only justice, but support services, and improve cooperation and communication between state authorities and non-governmental organizations. Because, you know, our Ukrainian history and our Ukrainian war history was based on the large support of our non-governmental authority representatives. So now it's a place for government and for state agencies to be included in this process also. So it's the first time when we have this specialized unit as a coordination center, as a unit of governmental agency. We provide support to people who have the status of victims and witnesses in criminal proceedings regarding war crimes and other international crimes. And of course, first of all, we provide this kind of support for the most vulnerable groups as children, as victims of torture, and of course, as victims of CRSV, as women, so as men. Specialty, we have law enforcement agencies, departments, as well as
We'll just maybe give it about 20 seconds to hopefully the connection can come back online. just going to take this time to check if Danielle Bell, who's also online, is connected, or if the whole connection has dropped. Danielle, are you with us?
Ambassador, I'm still with you, but I can't hear or see Veronica.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll see if she can rejoin. If not, Danielle, I may turn to you, and then we'll come back to Veronica if we can reestablish her full connection. Just give her another few seconds here before we do that. Okay, so apologies for the challenges, obviously, with the connection. We'll turn to you, Danielle, and then hopefully she'll be able to come back, and we'll go to her next. So Danielle Bell, just to remind, is the head of mission of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. The floor is yours, Danielle, and apologies again for the challenges in the connection.
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Arbiter, and thank you also to the permanent missions of Canada, Ukraine, and Liechtenstein, and of course the All Survivors Project for the opportunity to discuss a crucial yet often overlooked issue. In conflicts worldwide, boys and men often remain the silent victims of conflict-related sexual violence, or CRSV. In Ukraine, as mentioned by the General Prosecutor, more than half of the cases that we've documented are of men. As a quick bit of background, the UN Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine, we've been active in Ukraine since 2014, including documenting CRSV. We have offices in Kharkiv, Odessa, Dnipro, and Kyiv. And our offices across the country allow us to visit conflict-affected communities, and including frontline areas where we've been able to meet with people. We also visit places of detention as well as rehabilitation centers where Ukrainian prisoners of war, we interview them once they've returned from Russian captivity, and this is how we document the bulk of our findings. I would also add, in February 2022, after the full-scale invasion, the team of experts in Pramila Paten's office established a dedicated CRSV unit, which has helped enhance our monitoring and documentation efforts. So I'd like to say some words on our findings, and first, just to note that our findings are entirely consistent with the other international and domestic accountability mechanisms. So we're entirely consistent with the Office of the Prosecutor and with the COI, even though we work completely independently. Since the full-scale invasion, we've documented 275 cases of CRSV involving 184 men, 79 women, 10 girls and 2 boys, and men constitute over half, or 68% of the survivors, underscoring the significant impact. Regarding attribution, while we have documented very isolated incidents of sexual violence by Ukrainian authorities against Russian prisoners of war and civilian men and women detainees, it's mainly threats of sexual violence, threats. However, in stark contrast, nearly 90% of the cases we documented were perpetrated by authorities of the Russian Federation, primarily in detention settings in occupied areas of Ukraine, as well as within the Russian Federation. So as stated by the other speakers, these acts include forced nudity, threats of castration, beatings and electric shock to the genitals, attempted rape, and rape. We've documented that sexual violence has been used as a form of torture by the Russian Federation to extract information or confessions, to intimidate or compel detainees to cooperate with the occupying powers, and as a means of humiliation. I'll provide some examples. We've documented 108 incidents of sexual violence against Ukrainian prisoners of war held in facilities by the Russian Federation. Many of these men were detained for prolonged periods in multiple facilities where they endured repeated incidents of sexual violence. In recent months, so this is since January, we've interviewed 60 Ukrainian prisoners of war recently released from Russian captivity. Nearly all recounted torture, with 39 of the 60 men alleging or accounting, providing credible and reliable accounts of sexual violence. For example, one prisoner captured in April 2022 described 21 months of captivity involving sexualized torture in 3 different facilities. This man endured forced nudity, beatings on the genitals, threats of castration, electric shocks to his genitals, and attempted rape with an object. Many POWs also described to us being forced to perform degrading acts of a sexual nature. Additionally, my team has interviewed 48 civilian men who endured sexual violence whilst in custody of the Russian Federation in occupied territory. For example, one man was detained in 4 different facilities in Kherson region, and he described repeated torture during interrogation. For example, at one facility, he was subjected to electric shocks from a military phone, which is known as a TAPIC, with shocks to his lips and genitals, which is mockingly referred to as a, quote, a call to Biden, quote. At another facility, Russian police pulled down his trousers and attempted to castrate him with a utility knife. Disturbingly, as pointed out by Commissioner de Graft, the examples I've just provided are emblematic rather than exceptional. So we're asking ourselves, what concretely can be done now in terms of prevention, accountability, and reparations? First, we must all continue to advocate for the Russian Federation to adopt measures aimed at preventing torture, including sexual violence. So this would include punishing perpetrators of torture, improving conditions of detention, establishing mixed medical commissions for the reparation of the sick and the wounded, enabling communication between detainees and their families, and of course, unfettered access by independent and international monitors to all prisoners of war and civilian detainees held by the Russian Federation. Accountability is crucial. So I'd like to move to Ukraine to make some specific points. The national and international justice mechanisms must be or continue to be supported to support male survivors of sexual violence. And there's been a number of really solid efforts by the Ukrainian authorities and of course by the Office of the Prosecutor General. And in this regard, we commend the specialized CRSV unit of the Office of the Prosecutor General for their dedication to investigating sexual violence, utilizing a holistic, survivor-centered approaches. And I would add, we greatly appreciate the solid cooperation we have with this office. We also welcome the draft law on the status of CRSV survivors, which introduces reparations for survivors, and we encourage that such reparations take into account the specific needs of men. Lastly, from our side, we will continue to advocate for support services tailored for male survivors, which must be developed in close coordination and consultation with men to meet their specific needs. Thank you very much again for this opportunity to speak about this incredibly important issue.
Thank you, Danielle, and thanks for your flexibility and for sharing all the work that you and your team have done across Ukraine. I understand that we now, fortunately, are able to reconnect with Veronika Pletnikova, so I'll just give the floor back to her, and please accept our apologies for the challenges you had earlier. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I think it was challenges more from the Ukrainian side and our internet connection, but so on. I appreciate that we have such a great speech from the side of Daniel, and we are very excited with our cooperation and collaboration with the mission. And I will continue my speech about our efforts on the field of support for of victims of CRSV and victims of war crimes in general. So, yes, we said a lot about tailored services, and it's essential for us on this stage to provide, this full circle of services on the base and on the ground of needs assessment of victims. So now from our side, from the side of Coordination Center of Prosecutor General's Office, we provide the following services to victims and witnesses, but only with their consent and in compliance with the principle of confidentiality. So it's about how to educate victims and witnesses on their rights in criminal proceedings, supply information on the progress of the investigation and court proceedings, providing up-to-date information about court hearings, inform them about criminal justice system. But first of all, it's about consultations on the risk and prevention of re-victimization, refers victims and witnesses to appropriate psychological, medical, and social support services. Also, we provide physical accompaniment in court. We assist with the travel and accommodation of witnesses from other localities. For example, in Kyiv region, we already have such an experience. So also, it's about assisting in applying for payments to victims according to their needs and the capabilities of the partners. And first of all, in each case, we think that we have to start from the very first point, from the victim. Sometimes our victims, we know it surely, they are not ready to have help, to have the support, but they need to know that we are not, that they are now not alone, and we are on the safe side. So we have dedicated premises with sufficient security, confidentiality, and functionality, as well as a comfortable atmosphere for the psychological recovery of victims, including even the use of lighting and colors, furniture, and other elements that have a calming effect. Also, it's about first psychological support and long-term support. Now we are in process in cases of support as for civilians, so as for our ex-prisoners of war who had such an experience with sexual violence related to conflict. Our coordinators, they need to be trained, and they already have these trainings in cases of legal framework and cases of services provided by state authorities and non-governmental organizations, in cases of re-victimization, trauma, and its impact on victims. It's about communication with vulnerable victims. It's about gender and cultural diversity, working with confidential information, and of course, it's about communication. So, now we are on the verge of important institutional changes in general and our criminal justice. For the first time, we have a real chance to establish victim-oriented approach, because as Prosecutor General mentioned, and as our as representatives of our state mentioned, and maybe on the each of event, not on the long-term distance, we are on the marathon, and we need to be sure that our victims, that our nation is able to participate in this marathon, and that our victims are supported first of all from the side of the state. And finally, I want to finish what we started with from the side of your commitment for the Ukrainian people, because even now we have had a not only Ukrainian theme for this event, but we could say that justice for Ukrainian victims of CRSV, justice for male victims of CRSV would mean justice for the whole world and could establish a real mechanism for support, for the protection, and for the prevention of such unhuman cases. So I'm very delighted to be with you here and to tell you more about our efforts, and we are ready to cooperate on each step of our activities. Thanks a lot.
Our thanks to you very much, both for your participation today and for the work that you and your team are doing in Ukraine. It's now my pleasure to give the floor to Ms. Katarina Shunevich, head of the Analytical Center of the Ukrainian Women Lawyers Association, JURFA. You have the floor.
Dear colleagues, first of all, thank you very much for the possibility to have a floor here. I would like to start by reminding you that in 2022, the framework of the cooperation between the government of Ukraine and the United Nations on the prevention and response to conflict-related sexual violence was adopted. Despite the third year of the full-scale Russian invasion of Ukraine, ongoing active hostilities, constant shelling the work in the response to conflict-related sexual violence take place in a systematic and coordinated manner in Ukraine. For fulfillment obligation under the framework, it was established in Ukraine Interagency Working Group on combating sexual violence related to Russia armed aggression against Ukraine and assistance to the survivors, which includes of April 2024 55 organizations and 123 members. The right of a fair trial, as well as an effective help to survivors of CRSV crimes, are key priorities in the activity of the group. Therefore, the efforts of the Interagency Working Group are also aimed at strengthening the abilities of investigators and prosecutors in the identification of various types of conflict-related sexual violence. With strengthening the capacities of representatives of law enforcement agencies, attention is drawn to ensure the survivors of conflict-related sexual violence receive proper qualified legal assistance, which will contribute to improving their access to justice and returning to normal life after a traumatic experience, as well as psychological help. As was mentioned today, since the beginning of the full-scale Russian invasion, prosecutors have recorded 287 facts of CRSV, against men 102, against women 185, 15 minors, and it's only official data about official criminal procedure. We understand that number of cases will be more after the territory will be deoccupied. Among them, as was mentioned, there are such types as rape, mutilation, violence to genitals, forced nudity, forced pregnancy, threats or attempts to rape, forcing to watch sexual abuse of a family, etc. All of these are nothing but patterns, weapons for destruction of the Ukrainian nation, and we clearly understand its being on Ukraine now. The number of affected persons is increasing with the occupation territories. This includes a growing number of affected persons among male held in captivity and subject to torture, rape, and genital manipulation by electrocution. Our organization provides legal assistance, including legal support during criminal proceedings to victims of CRSV. Among the tendencies we observe the following. First of all, as was mentioned previously, the victims are both women and men, boys and girls, and even the whole families where wife, husband, and children suffer from CRSV. Men, compared to women, as practice shows, talk about their experience more openly, say that they were tortured. They didn't tell a lot about CRSV cases, but more about torture. One reason we suggest is that the concept of torture is less stigmatizing, and that is why it's easier to report about these cases. However, in the process of interviewing such person, it is established that such actions against the person were of a sexual nature and therefore constitute conflict-related sexual violence. We believe it is necessary for pre-trial investigation bodies to further implement victim-oriented approaches in the Ukrainian criminal process. At the same time, taking into account the specificity of the use of form of sexual violence against men, for example, as I mentioned, it's the use of electric current. It is important when, for example, we conduct on national level different investigation actions, for example, as interrogation, we need to properly choose the place of our interrogation, taking into account the previous experience of survivors, as well as to avoid the use of such methods, for example, as polygraph, kind of lie detector, in order to avoid re-traumatization of the victims. It's very important in order to provide this sensitive approach when we communicate with them. In addition, often boys and men affected by conflict-related sexual violence cannot receive sufficient, appropriate, high-quality and timely services. One of the reasons because it was previously lack of information that, for example, men or boys can suffer from it. There is a huge need in Ukraine to develop a support system, medical and other services for affected men. In Ukraine, there are some NGOs that provide specialized assistance for the women who are affected by conflict-related sexual violence. But there is a need to develop the system considering the need of affected men too. Finally, a significant number of victims may still be in the territories of Ukraine temporarily occupied by Russian Federation. Therefore, the liberation of such territories from the aggressor is a priority today to effectively and urgently provide assistance and support to victims of the conflict-related sexual violence.
Thank you very much, Katerina. And we'll now turn to my right to Charulata Hogg, the founder and director of the All Survivors Project. You have the floor.
Thank you, Ambassador Arbiter. Excellencies, friends, it is an honor for me to be here among all of you today. At the outset, I would like to thank the victims and survivors from Ukraine and indeed from many other places who have placed their trust in us. I would like to thank the permanent missions of Canada, Liechtenstein, Colombia, and Ukraine for their abiding support in standing by All Survivors Project to bring attention to the issue of sexual violence against men and boys in conflict settings. We are grateful to the others who've spoken around this panel today, the Office of the Prosecutor General, the Commissioner from the Independent Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, and finally, our partners, the Ukrainian Women Lawyers Association, JURFEM, for their efforts in bringing attention on this issue. Excellencies, ASP, All Survivors Project, believes that expanding space for survivor voices must be coupled with more radical power sharing and their participation in decision-making. It is with that intent that I bring you some words from a group of survivors from Kherson. And I quote begins, "We have clearly experienced the torture that people in the occupied territories know. The unrestrained aggression and hatred of our people. No diplomacy, no negotiation will help stop the violence. We need victory. On behalf of all the victims who have survived conflict-related sexual violence and those who recognize the torture, we are committed to support all efforts to help Ukraine stand, to help stop this violation of people's rights. Ukrainian people who suffered the CRSV as a result of the aggression of the Russian Federation are beginning to unite for active actions. We want to gain freedom, ensure fair punishment for our people and for our Ukraine." Quote ends. Colleagues, All Survivors Project was set up 7 years back to support global efforts to eradicate CRSV and to strengthen national and international responses to it through research and action on CRSV against men and boys. In doing so, we complement and reinforce existing work on CRSV against women and girls, recognizing the disproportionate impact of CRSV on them and the way in which gendered inequalities, institutions, and identities drive this form of violence. Our research shows that although such CRSV takes place in many different circumstances, including during armed attacks, house searches, and at checkpoints and border crossings, there are some specific contexts in which the risk of CRSV to men and boys is greatly heightened. These include military settings and situations of forced displacement. However, sexual violence against men and boys has been most widely reported in situations of deprivation of liberty than in any other setting. Most of the recorded incidents have taken place in state detention facilities, official and unofficial, often against individuals held because of their real or perceived opposition to the state, or because they or their family members have or are presumed to have links with opposing forces. Sexual violence against men who are conflict-related detainees is part of a deliberate policy in some countries. For example, in Syria, where thousands of men and boys detained by the state have been subjected to sexual violence, rape has been found to form part of a widespread and systematic attack directed against a civilian population by government forces and associated militia. My co-panelists have already demonstrated the widespread use of torture, including sexual violence against Ukrainian detainees, civilian and prisoners of war, male and female, by authorities and security forces in the Russian Federation. Within the group of men and boys, we find that boys, particularly young boys, teenagers, and adolescents, are at high risk of conflict-related arrest and detention and are highly vulnerable to sexual violence in this context. We did a review of secondary data in 2022 and found reports of sexual torture against boys in state-run detention facilities in Afghanistan, Iraq, Myanmar, Nigeria, South Sudan, Syria, and Yemen, and by non-state armed groups in Central African Republic, Iraq, Somalia, Syria, and Yemen. Armed conflict can also heighten the risk of sexual violence against men and boys with diverse sexual orientation, gender identity, expression, and sex characteristics, both exacerbating pre-existing discrimination-based vulnerabilities and giving rise to new ones. Despite increased attention on this issue, conflict-related sexual violence against men and boys remains significantly underreported and undocumented. The extent and gendered nature of harms resulting from it remain insufficiently understood, and justice, health, and other rehabilitation responses are largely inadequate. Why does this happen? Firstly, due to a range of multiple intersecting and mutually reinforcing barriers, men and boys are reluctant to disclose their experience. And in cases we have found sometimes it takes months, years, even decades. One of the victims of sexual violence we work with in another context has disclosed his sexual violence to us after 40 years, and we were the first ones that he spoke to. Secondly, despite increasing documentation, monitoring, and reporting on CRSV against men and boys, this monitoring is not systematic, and there are significant gaps in terms of understanding its scale, nature, and impact on victim survivors, the families, and the communities. Thirdly, lack of gender-inclusive laws, protocols, and procedures can prevent victims and survivors of sexual violence from realizing their right to remedy and reparation, and they can undermine gender-competent, survivor-centered approaches in justice processes. Fourthly, the categorization, which my colleague Katerina referred to, of sexual violence against males as torture or other forms of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment obscures the sexual dimension of the act and the full extent of harms that have been suffered. Male victim survivors need to be consulted on the design and implementation of justice processes. Special measures, including outreach procedures, training for investigators, and dedicated sessions to facilitate victim survivors of CRSV to come forward, need to be designed. And finally, despite the devastating physical and mental health consequences, quality, timely, survivor-centered medical and mental health and psychosocial support is often unavailable. So what should be done? We have 4 main recommendations. Firstly, Survivor-centered approaches to sexual violence against men and boys are evolving and should result in proactive efforts towards enabling survivors, individually and collectively, to navigate their own paths towards recovery from violence. Secondly, survivor-centered approaches cannot but be intersectional if they are to be safe, adequate, competent, and transformative for male survivors in all their diversity. Thirdly, multi-sectoral interventions are required across prevention, justice, and health, and across policy and practice to improve responses for victims and survivors. Finally, we need to expand the evidence base to deepen our understanding of barriers, opportunities, and the vision of CRSV survivors that lie at these intersections of marginalization and disadvantage that are the hardest to tackle. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Charu, including for your recommendations at the end that apply, I think, universally. Before opening the floor, we'll now hear from the Ambassador and Permanent Representative of Ukraine. Sergei, you have the floor.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Richard. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like, first of all, to express my gratitude to our esteemed speakers for their invaluable contribution and insights. I also like to extend special thanks to the missions of Canada, Colombia, Liechtenstein, and the All Survivors Project for their collaboration in organizing today's event. As today's open debates on conflict-related sexual violence continue in the Security Council, it is a timely opportunity to draw attention to the appalling issue of sexual violence against men, widely and systematically perpetrated by Russian occupiers against both prisoners of war and civilians in detention. Today's discussion reaffirmed that the United Nations possesses ample verified body of evidence as highlighted in reports from the UN Secretary General, the Independent Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, and the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. These reports underscore the widespread and systematic use of sexual violence by Russian forces as a weapon of war and torture. This was further echoed today by Pablo de Grief, Commissioner of the Independent Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine, and Daniel Bell, Head of the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine. Additionally, the Commission's findings shed light on the hierarchical structure within Russian army and law enforcement agencies involved in the commission of torture, as well as the knowledge of superiors and prevailing sense of impunity. As we heard from the Prosecutor General of Ukraine, the testimonies of survivors released from Russian captivity are profoundly disturbing. It is appalling that more than 50% of detainees experience torture, rape, or other forms of ill treatment at the hands of the Russian captors. With tens of thousands of Ukrainians remaining in Russian captivity, including POWs, civilians, men and women, it is imperative that we use all available means to protect and rescue these individuals from the horrors they endure daily. We strongly believe that Russian army and Russian law enforcement agencies such as the FSB belong on a list as a party to the conflict reliably suspected of committing acts of rape or other forms of sexual violence. Impunity breeds more violence. This is why we call on all member states and the United Nations officials to redouble our efforts to exert pressure on Russia to cease its brutal, unprovoked, and unjustifiable war of aggression against Ukraine and put an end to its heinous war crimes and crimes against humanity. Finally, let me share with you an excerpt of the documentary, which is called Intercepted. It was shown recently at Lincoln Center and MoMA in New York City. It was produced, by the way, with the help of our Canadian friends. The film explores phone calls intercepted from Russian soldiers on the Ukrainian battlefield to their families in Russia. It is a deeply important but unsettling film that requires viewers to be emotionally resilient. It reveals instances of extreme human suffering that are hard to comprehend in the 21st century. It is especially tough to think about the male victims enduring sexualized torture by the Russians. What is even more disturbing is the lack of remorse shown by the perpetrators, who not only don't regret their actions, but actually boast about them and derive pleasure, often receiving approval from their family members. Let me share a piece of a dialogue from the documentary, a conversation between a Russian soldier serving in Ukraine and his mother. The soldier says, "Actually, I took part in it. The FSB officers tortured prisoners. Do you know what a rose is?" The mother, "No, I don't." "You can make 21 roses on a man's body, 20 fingers and the genitals. Sorry for the wording." "Okay, I get it," says the mother. "Have you seen how a rose blooms, how it opens?" Sorry, this is too hard to read. It's better to play the dialogue on the screen. The text is in Russian because the conversation was intercepted in Russian, but there are subtitles, so I encourage you to read the subtitles, please.
Алло.
Рыбка моя.
Привет. Как дела?
Как у тебя дела?
Да, отлично. Только с бани приехал.
Откуда приехал?
С бани.
Ну, а ты не в бане ездите?
Ну да, баней называем тот самый шланг, с которого нас поливают, там под ним моемся.
Очень хорошо, девушка. Это здорово, что-то можно сказать.
Сходим картошку не берем. Ой, у селян. Он такой типа...
И вам продают или так дают?
Так дают. Купа набрали, книги читаем, да. Культурно развиваемся.
Ну, смотрите, только аккуратнее с этими селянами.
Да?
Да. Везде в церквях это самое. Идут 40-устые заказаны конкретно на себя. В Балтийске, в Калининграде, в Советске 2 церкви и в этом самом в Плавске. Так что, зайка, все хорошо. Неужели ты думаешь, что мама как-то оставит это все? Нет.
У нас тут, знаешь, у меня на глазах, короче, ну как, я тоже в этом участвовал. Мы пытали пленных. ФСБшники. Знаешь, что такое розочка?
Нет.
На теле мужчины можно сделать 21 розу.
Это
20 пальцев и член. Прошу прощения за выражение.
Ага.
Вот. Видела, как розочка, когда распускается, так раскрывается?
Да.
Вот. Также вдоль кости кожа слезается с мяса на всех пальцах. Вот. Потом то же самое делается и там. Вот это называется 21 роза на теле мужчин. Еще знаешь, какие пытки я видел?
Какие? А почему ты говоришь, что ты принимал участие? Ну, это ФСБшники.
Захватывали же, пленных приводили.
Ну.
И пока ждали начальников вот этих вот камер, пыток. Держали, лупили, ломали ноги, чтобы не убежали. Поймали мирного мужика, вот пацаны. Взяли у него телефон. в телефоне фотографии всех позиций. Положено, фоткал позиции, скидывал им.
Вот поэтому я тебе говорю, что нельзя им верить. Хохлы.
И этого мужика, старика, забили палками резиновыми.
Ага.
Забили до смерти. Представляешь, да, сколько там должно быть ударов, сколько всего должно произойти, чтобы резиновой обычной палкой, ну, успокоительная она называется. Вот один еще метод пытки, это трубу в жопу вставляют.
А, даже так?
Да. И колючую проволоку туда засовывают. Сказали, что вот эта вот проволока, это еще с Чечни. Да.
А ты знаешь, как украинцы издеваются над нашими?
Знаешь?
Да?
Поэтому даже ни капельки сожаления нету.
Ты что?
Мы когда сидели, вот этот вот мужик, которого привели, пленный, говорит, за мою жизнь, мои пацаны две ваших заберут. Он сидит такой, знаешь, это, говорит, мне плевать на смерть, я умираю за правду. А он сидит, вот он привязан к стулу, да, у него сломаны эти крестообразные кости, ну, которые я ломал. И все, он замолчал. Это так нравится?
Нравится?
Нравится, я не знаю, почему.
А я тебе всегда говорила, что, в принципе, что во мне, то, что я себя сдерживаю. Если бы я вот так вот попала туда, я бы тоже кайфовала от этого. Мы же с тобой одинаковые.
Я понимаю, что уже здесь крыша едет. И для меня это нормальные вещи такое говорить.
Нет, у тебя крыша не едет, у тебя все в порядке.
Я тебе говорю, людей тут убиваем.
Ты уверен, что это люди? Это не люди.
Я ж вообще добряком был. Я тебе говорю, ты просто... как я хочу тебе все рассказать. Как хочу, чтобы ты увидела вот это вот все, что во мне поменялось.
So, I broke his fingers brutally, and I love it so much. And the mother tells him, "You're not getting crazy, you're fine." With that, I hope you now have a better understanding of why this topic is so critically important, and it really desperately needs addressing. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Sergey. I can understand why it was difficult to read. It was also difficult to listen and to watch, but difficulty doesn't mean means we need to listen and we need to watch. We need to understand what's happening. So thank you for sharing. Thanks to everyone else. We don't have a tremendous amount of time, but we do have a little bit to open the floor, and I'm going to first turn to my colleague, the DPR from Liechtenstein. You have the floor, Mira.
Thank you so much, Richard, and good afternoon, colleagues. Liechtenstein is glad to co-sponsor today's event, and we extend our thanks to all the briefers here today, and especially also to Charu from the All Survivors Project, who has been doing groundbreaking work on this topic of conflict-related sexual violence against all survivors for many years. And as we have heard today by the briefers, sexual violence is committed in virtually every armed conflict, while women and girls continue to be disproportionately affected. In certain circumstances, however, such as prison settings, men and boys make up the majority of victims, and this is also rightly acknowledged in Security Council Resolution 2467. In this regard, we are deeply concerned about the reports of systematic use of sexual violence against Ukrainian prisoners of war by Russian authorities in the context of the Russian aggression. Accountability for conflict-related sexual violence and access to justice remain significant challenges in Ukraine because of the scale of the violations, as we have heard today, and because they were and continue to be committed in territory not under the control of Ukrainian authorities and in some cases in the Russian Federation itself. We are grateful for the high-level attention to the issue both within Ukraine and internationally, as also exemplified by today's briefers, and also the important measures already taken to end impunity and provide victims and survivors with redress. In all armed conflicts, stigma and cultural taboos, along with norms around masculinities, as well as the absence of trained and sensitized justice sector actors, contribute to the many barriers that men in particular face in assessing support. And in this regard, I wish to highlight once again the important work done by the All Survivors Project. And I wish also to commend the important work by the international justice system with the groundbreaking role, of course, of the Rome Statute of the ICC, and which we also encourage to prioritize these crimes. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Miriam. We may have time for one or two more. Is there anyone who would like to take the floor? Yes, please, if you can introduce yourself as well. I'm sorry, we don't have the nameplates.
Sure. My name is Georgia Tortora. Sorry. My name is Georgia Tortora, and I'm with the team of experts on sexual violence in conflict in the office of SRSG Patton. Thank you so much for organizing this event, and thank you to all the speakers. I just have a question on the documentation efforts that are ongoing in Ukraine. We know that there are many entities that are involved in this work, and I was just wondering, maybe from Pablo, but also from the other speakers, what is your perception of how these efforts are coming together? We know that information is in different places, and we just wanted to double check with you whether you think that you are getting access and it's clear to survivors being interviewed by different entities where the information is going. But thank you, and thanks also to the Canadian mission also for the support that is providing to the TOE effort in Ukraine. Thanks.
That's an excellent question. Thank you for raising that issue. I believe we also will hear from our partners from Colombia, and then we'll come back over here, please.
Time-wise, it's fine. We can.
You're sure?
Thank you.
Anybody else before? All right. Pablo, would you like to?
So thank you very much for the question. As you know, all commissions of inquiry create archives that are eventually transferred to the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. Danielle also pointed out the fact that despite the independence of each of the entities that work on this issue from the UN and the ICC, the monitoring mission, the International Criminal Court, and the Commission, despite our independence, our results are converging. And, for example, the ICC makes frequent requests to the Commission for documentation, and it is using some of that documentation that we accumulate for the investigation and the prosecution of its cases. So the aspiration, of course, is that that documentation can also be used, for example, by national jurisdictions under the universal jurisdiction principle, and that this is a contribution to the criminal accountability that is part of the broad notion of accountability that we promote. We also have excellent communication with the Office of the Prosecutor in Ukraine as well, and we appreciate very much the collaboration that they give us, and we hope that some of the work that we do also helps the Office of the Prosecutor in the gargantuan task that he and his office faces.
Well, thank you very much. So let me just, very briefly, in closing, extend our deep gratitude to all of our briefers, in particular those who are joining us from Ukraine, not only for sharing the work that you're doing, but for the work that you're doing, and all of your teams here. Let me thank our partners from the permanent missions of Colombia, of Liechtenstein and of Ukraine, and of course from All Survivors Project for continuing to ensure that there's greater amounts of attention paid to this issue, both in Ukraine and also more broadly. So a big thank you to you, Charo, in particular, and to your team. And thanks to everyone for your participation with us today. Thanks very much.